In this video I'm going to be making a radiator cat bed for my cat Dylan. I've noticed that in the winter he spends a lot of time sitting near the radiator, so I thought I'd make him somewhere comfortable to sleep. I considered buying one, but the ones you can buy are kind of ugly, so I wanted to make something that looked a little nicer, and also I thought it'd make for an interesting project. I first took some measurements of the radiators in my house and I did a quick SketchUp drawing to represent what I wanted to build. Plans and a full cut list for this project will be available via my Patreon page if you are interested in building this project. I had lots of small but long strips of mahogany and I ripped them down to about 6mm in thickness using the table saw. And then using the dimensions from my drawing, I could cut all of the pieces to length at the mitre saw using a stop block to make the cuts that needed to be made at a consistent length. Some of the pieces were quite short, so I used a push stick to hold down the workpieces to keep my fingers a safe distance away from the blade. With all of the pieces cut, I'd start by assembling these two brackets. I applied glue and started to assemble the pieces, alternating between long pieces and shorter pieces, and that's because I wanted to form some finger joints at all of the corners in order to create lots of gluing surface to maximise the strength of the cat bed, because it's going to be cantilevered off a radiator and it needs to hold the weight of my cat, who is getting pretty chunky lately. Too many dreamies. Once all of the pieces were positioned, I checked for square and fired in a few brad nails to keep everything held in place while the glue dried. I could then wipe away excess glue with a damp cloth. Here you'll see that there are some additional finger joints at what would be the front of the cat bed, and these weren't actually necessary, so later in the video you'll see me cutting these pieces off flush, and I've corrected the plans to reflect that too. Once all that was done, I decided to add an additional fourth layer of strips just to hide the brad nails that I'd fired in, and this would also add even more strength to the bed. And those just got clamped in place until the glue dried. I could then clean up all of the faces, and I did most of this at the benchtop sander, but there were some places that were difficult to get to, so for those I used my electric file. When all the sanding was done, I noticed there were a few small gaps visible between some of the joints, so I rubbed in some wood glue and then sprinkled on some dust that I'd collected from my belt sanders collection box. I rubbed that in and then scraped the surfaces, and then the gaps were no longer visible. And I did some final sanding using my random orbit sander. At this point I wanted to check that the brackets fitted over the radiator okay, as I wasn't sure if the windowsills would interfere with the way that they pushed in place, but they slotted in there perfectly. For the base of the bed I'd used some of this thin plywood. This is about 5mm thick. It was already almost the right size, but I needed to cut it to length, which I did at the table saw, and then I could glue and nail it in place. This plywood was ideal because it was nice and light, so it wouldn't add too much weight to the bed. It is quite thin though, and without bracing it would be prone to sagging over time, but I'm going to be adding some more strips of wood to all four sides of the bed, which will make it nice and rigid so that the plywood won't be able to sag. After marking for length and cutting, I applied some glue and nailed them in place. I first fitted the bottom piece and then a top piece, and then I could add a centerpiece just by eye to get it sitting level and equally spaced, and I did the same for the back of the bed. Then I switched to the sides, and here I'm using epoxy rather than wood glue because it was a cold day, so wood glue was taking a while to set, and I wanted to get this project done in a day. The side pieces could just be lined up level with the front and back pieces, again just by eye, and I clamped all of those in place. I mentioned earlier that these finger joints at the front were not needed. I must have cut these pieces to length without thinking it through properly, so here I'm cutting off the joints with my Japanese pull saw. I did some final hand sanding just to break over any sharp edges. And then I applied some of my handmade oil wax. I'm using the food safe version here, which is a mixture of mineral oil and beeswax, and I applied it with a paintbrush to get into all of the nooks and crannies. This wood finish, as well as the original recipe, is available to buy via my Etsy store if you're interested in trying it out. It pops the grain really nicely, as you can see, and it made the finger joints look really nice too. Once everything was coated, I wiped away any excess with a cloth, and that was the finishing done. The final job was to make a cushion for the bed, and I had some 400mm square foam pieces which were about 25mm thick, which I bought a while ago from eBay. Each piece cost about £2. I marked it up for size and used a sharp knife and a ruler to cut it. And I wrapped the foam in some fabric which I had left over from some old curtains which I bought in a charity shop. I didn't want to add a back panel to this because I wanted to keep it as light as possible, so I just wrapped the fabric around the foam and used my hot glue gun to glue the fabric to itself. And then I could fold over the edges and glue them in place too. And the hot glue worked great to hold the fabric in place. Whenever I want my cat to notice something new, I always put some worn clothes on top. This is a good way to encourage them to use something. And sure enough, the following day I found him on the bed, and in the evening he really made himself comfortable. I can then remove the clothing now that the bed has my scent on it, and now he knows it's a safe place to curl up and get comfortable. I really enjoyed making this one, and I think it came out pretty nice. I really like the way that the finger joints look, and also how the cream fabric contrasts against the dark mahogany wood. This one took about 7 or 8 hours in total to build. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already for more weekly woodworking videos. You can also support the channel via Patreon if you'd like to get early access to my videos, downloadable woodworking plans and cut lists, and your name as a credit at the end of my videos, plus some exclusive content. Thank you for watching.